Welcome to Cascades Analytics Live. My name is Alexandre Stepanovic, founder of Cascade Analytics, an independent research and advisory platform focused on psychedelics and neuroplastogens. We go where the action is, speaking with the scientists, founders, and regulators shaping the next generation of psychiatric treatments. Today, we're asking a very practical yet crucial question. What are the pillars of a successful IND filing, investigational new drug? And how could the recent executive order from the White House change how companies approach the process? My guest today is Kimberly, a lawyer from Husch Blackwell, who advises life sciences and emerging therapy companies on clinical trials, regulatory risk, and litigation, particularly where science, law, and new technologies intersect. Hi, Kim. Thank you for joining us today.
Hi, Alex. Thank you so much for having me.
Of course. So why don't we dive right in? The executive order speeds things up, but the IND requirements haven't changed. So what do you tell a sponsor who thinks this just made everything easier?
Yeah, I do hear that quite a bit in this space. So the executive order created acceleration opportunities, but it basically raises the stakes for application quality. It doesn't lower the bar. So what hasn't changed are, as you mentioned, the IND safety requirements are identical, whether or not you have a national priority voucher. So you still need comprehensive preclinical talks, PK data, abuse liability studies. Phase 1 still requires dose escalation safety. Phase 3 still requires controlled trial meetings with FDA evidence, and adhering to the evidence standard that's been set by the FDA. But what the executive order does change is how compressed the timeline gets. So if you have breakthrough therapy designation status, the FDA compresses that review from and a national priority voucher. So you get one of the vouchers, the FDA compresses the review from 10 months to 1 to 2 months. So the critical point is that this compressed timeline magnifies deficiencies in the application rather than excusing anything. The bar is still the same. So I would say that the key for anyone who's gotten, and I believe they've just been announced this morning, the national priority voucher.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's very exciting, is to use those periods strategically. So that priority voucher program offers enhanced pre-submission meetings and use those meetings to align on endpoints and safety monitoring before your NDA submission. So stress test your application across clinical efficacy, durability data, and CMC maturity, REMS design. So really the risk is submitting your application prematurely. So under the Commissioner's National Priority Voucher, you'll reach a complete response letter even sooner, but it's not a win if your application wasn't ready.
And there's going to be pressure to chase veterans because the White House mentioned them, and also treatment-resistant populations because the EO's framing points there. But how do you keep a sponsor from running into a trial they can't actually execute?
Well, that's a good question, and they were indeed pointed out specifically in the executive order. I would say that's where basically policy optics and operational reality diverge. The first section of the executive order references over 6,000 veteran suicides per year at rates twice the non-veteran population, and that creates an enormous pressure on sponsors to enroll veterans. But it doesn't create the infrastructure to do that successfully. So in reality, the executive order directed HHS and FDA and the VA to collaborate. But that's a coordination mandate, not an enrollment guarantee. So, the VA medical centers operate under distinct IRB structures with separate informed consent requirements and, VA-specific protocol approvals. So a sponsor can't just simply add VA sites to an existing trial infrastructure. If they try to do that right now, they'll be setting themselves up for many months of delay. And for treatment-resistant populations, the executive order positions psychedelics for such patients, specifically calling out treatment-resistant populations. And that's clinically appropriate, but it kind of creates a trial design complication because with that population, you have a higher baseline suicide risk and ambiguous comparator selection when patients have failed multiple medications and durability endpoints. What is it that's the criteria that you are, designing your clinical trial for? And then you have the right to try aspect of the executive order that confounds this a bit. So in section 2B of the executive order, it specifically calls out the right to try aspect and would enable basically pre-approval, pre-FDA approval access outside of a clinical trial to these investigational drugs. And so that right to try framework is not quite there yet. There is just basically no Schedule I licensing available for physicians as it stands today. So there's going to have to be some changes made in order to allow that to happen. But once that activates, then you'll have treatment-resistant patients who presumably exhausted other options, and then they will have access to your psychedelic drug, investigational drug, outside of a trial, which could create recruitment competition as well as selection bias. So, while the executive order created political tailwinds, the priority doesn't translate to operational feasibility. I would only pursue, the veteran populations if you have the infrastructure and the partnerships, and as well as a protocol rigor that's already set up to execute this successfully, not simply because it was mentioned in the executive order.
Does that removing this bottleneck that the executive order, that's what it does, and time compresses, is that going to flood or reveal the flaws in the clinics for PTSD patients, you think? Or
I think it might do both, frankly. It's still early days. The executive order was just signed on Saturday. So it will be interesting to see exactly how this will shake out in terms of whether, we have seen increased interest, definitely in psychedelic development because of the executive order. And I don't know on terms of patient populations, how that translates into whether we'll see a lot more people signing up for clinical trials or whether they will wait for the right to try pathway to open up. I think time will tell. It's been less than a week. It's been very exciting times.
Yes. Breakthrough therapy designation now unlocks national priority vouchers, like you said. But what separates an application that gets granted from one that doesn't? And can a sponsor lose eligibility if the phase 3 indication drifts from what earned them the designation?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. And there might be something that might happen because of the increased pressure under the national priority voucher. As we've been talking about, it's only a 1 to 2 month review timeline. So just going back to the executive order, section 2A of the executive order creates basically, it mentions the two-stage front. So as you mentioned, first, that sponsor needs to have achieved breakthrough therapy designation status. And then second, you need to meet all the national priority voucher criteria, which include things like, large unmet medical need, which tracks along with the breakthrough therapy designation status. But it also must address a public health crisis, tie it to suicide rates and veterans' mental health, which is what the executive order did. And it also talks about the national priority vouchers also talk about affordability as well as onshoring supply chain resilience. So all those, make it down to a kind of a few pool as we saw, I think early this morning, which I can't even remember who the 3 national priority voucher awardees were as of this morning.
Otsuka's, Compass,
Otsuka.
and Usona.
Oh my gosh, yeah. So there's a couple of, yeah, that's very interesting. So but definitely all three of those entities have attained breakthrough therapy designation status. That's been known for a while, but yeah, very exciting times. But in terms of going back to your question, the yeah, you do have to be careful about any kind of drift in your phase 3, if it might drift from what gained the breakthrough therapy designation to begin with. So basically, if you're, in your breakthrough therapy designation status, in order to gain that, if you claimed that you're a substantial improvement and superiority to treatment-resistant depression, you would have to basically maintain that through the, the National Priority Voucher as well. So the difference is, I would think, is submission readiness. The FDA's guidance, recommends submitting like CMC data, draft labeling, and manufacturing facility information at least 60 days before the NDA, and then 120 days if foreign inspections are needed. So, sponsors might get denied if their CMC data reflects clinical trial material, IND, that is investigational product material, instead of commercial manufacturing. So if scale up isn't complete, or if a REMS design is incomplete. But as to indication drift, that's a critical risk because specific drug dose formulation and patient population, that's very breakthrough therapy. That's what got them the breakthrough therapy designation status to begin with. So if your phase 3 indication drifts from what earned that breakthrough therapy designation status, then you'll have a couple of problems. So your breakthrough therapy designation status may no longer apply if you're allowed to drift. And then the National Priority Voucher eligibility would also evaporate, since you would need that breakthrough therapy designation status as basically as a pre-qualifier in order to even get the National Priority Voucher. So if the filed NDA indication doesn't match your breakthrough therapy designation status, you just may not qualify. So it's best for sponsors to align their phase 3 with their breakthrough therapy designation scope right from the start. So if your development plan evolves, consider submitting a breakthrough therapy kind of supplement requesting expansion before you complete your phase 3. I would not assume that your National Priority Voucher is permanent. I would treat it as contingent, as to maintaining that alignment with your breakthrough therapy designation through the NDA submission period. So indication drift isn't just a regulatory technicality. It's basically an eligibility risk that could cost you the 1 to 2 month review timeline.
So the right to try, you briefly talked about it. The right to try means patients will access these drugs outside clinical trials. Does a sponsor running a formal program have any legal obligation to monitor or respond to adverse events generated through access they didn't initiate?
Yeah, and that is a very sharp question. I think that cuts right to the heart of Section 2B out of the executive order. It's unprecedented that a right to try access pathway that with a Schedule 1 drug that the sponsor doesn't control, but they may still have some regulatory obligations around. So just to back up a little bit.
What's the responsibility in
Yeah, that's a great question. So the Right to Try Act does, the Federal Right to Try Act, there's a couple, there's state level as well as federal, but we're just focusing on the Federal Right to Try Act.
Right.
It does limit sponsor obligations. So participation is voluntary on the behalf, on the, the sponsors are not obligated to, they're not mandated to participate in Right to Try. It's completely voluntary. And the statute provides some liability protections, but it doesn't exempt sponsors from the existing adverse event reporting obligations under the regulations. The regulations require IND holders to report serious and unexpected adverse events to the FDA, regardless of whether they occurred during in their own clinical trial or outside of the clinical trial.
So monitoring.
Monitoring, and reporting back to the FDA. So it's kind of a gray zone. If the sponsor provides a psychedelic access, to their access to their psychedelic investigational drug through right to try, the physician would then take on the primary reporting responsibility. But the sponsor, it still has secondary obligations. So if the sponsor does become aware of a serious adverse event through physician reports, patient reports, or even media coverage, that's a possibility. The regulations require reporting to the FDA, that the sponsor report this to the FDA within 15 days of these unexpected events, or 7 days if there is a fatal or life-threatening event. So even though the sponsor didn't initiate this, it doesn't mean there's no obligation. Once they provide the drug, they've kind of entered into a regulatory relationship that triggers IND safety reporting requirements. So even though, our right to try operates, largely outside of FDA oversight, there is, for instance, there's no IND amendments required, on behalf of the sponsor. There's no mandated protocol. There's no mandated monitoring plan, but it creates asymmetry. So, unless you, as a sponsor, create the channels, physicians may not have unless you establish that clear channel, they may not have an obligation to report back to you. And it may be in your best interest as a sponsor to get those reports before they come out, someplace else, like a social media channel or something else like that. You want to get ahead of that. So I wouldn't treat right to try as access that you didn't initiate. I would structure it as, a managed expanded access program, and require physicians who are interested in offering this to sign agreements committing to adverse event reporting, and then establish
any screening
registry. Maybe screening, absolutely. A screening might be something. I don't know if the sponsor wants to take that on, but screening might be advisable, especially with certain, higher risk drugs that might require more monitoring, depending on, what the sponsor wants to risk in terms of how the optics about how this might come out. Because it's not under their sponsor's purview, and so it's largely outside of the regulatory framework. Unless they insist on things like, screening physicians and clinics that want to offer this, or establishing a patient registry in order to capture things like baseline characteristics, maybe treatment details and outcomes. And, then that could serve as potentially a couple of purposes, like, safety monitoring, as well as like real world evidence generation, which might be advantageous to the sponsor. So basically, once you provide the drug as a sponsor, you assumed regulatory and ethical obligations. No one can afford, no sponsor can afford to treat right to try as like, oh, it's not our responsibility, because you'd be setting yourself up for surprises that could eventually, hopefully won't derail, but it could put you at risk for derailing an FDA approval, since it's outside of your control, basically.
And so the DEA now reviews scheduling concurrently with FDA review and not after approval. So what does that mean for how sponsors collect abuse potential data from their very first trial?
Well, just to back up a little bit, the executive order doesn't establish concurrent DEA scheduling review during FDA's investigational phases. So Schedule 5 of the executive order states that the Attorney General shall review products that have, quote, successfully completed phase 3 clinical trials, so that rescheduling, quote, may proceed as quickly as practicable for such specific products that are ultimately approved. So that's about compressing the post-approval rescheduling, not concurrent review throughout development. But that being said, Yeah,
Which,
but I mean, I could see where, where it'd be it's kind of not entirely clear. But so I read that to mean as, we are going to go, we're not changing any of the regulations in terms of that aspect. But that
Mhm.
being said, as you mentioned, there is already, abuse potential, that is, all the sophisticated sponsors engage with DEA early, even though it's not mandated. So the FDA guidance requires human abuse potential studies before NDA submission. So the DEA uses that same abuse liability data for scheduling review under the 8-factor analysis test, under federal law. So proactive DEA engagement during the early phases, like phase 1 and phase 2, shape trial design. So what comparator drugs to use, what effect scales, like subjective effect scales, are the most relevant, and what data would support a rescheduling classification. So if we interpret the question, how should sponsors approach abuse potential collection given the increased focus on timely rescheduling, I would say, starting in phase 1, collect your PK data that's relevant to abuse potential. So drugs with rapid onset, high peak concentrations, could have higher abuse potentials. And document subjective effects systematically, using validated scales, such as like the drug effects questionnaire, and do it systematically. So other things to potentially consider are scales like the mystical experience questionnaire, in order to differentiate between mystical and therapeutic experiences from recreational drug effects. So, and then by the time you reach phase 2, you would conduct more formal human abuse studies, which could be crossover studies in recreational drug users, and comparing your psychedelic, you know, therapeutic to the candidate drug to a positive control and a placebo. So that's where you would assess physical dependence potential, evaluate diversion risk, and and also just really critically look at your formulation and administration model at that point. So before the NDA, you would have your complete abuse liability assessment, such as preclinical studies, human abuse potential studies, epidemiological data, if that's available, which it is for a lot of these psychedelics, as they've been used in a great deal of population, and contribute your analysis of the adverse events that are suggestive of abuse. So that's when you would prepare the scheduling argument, even though the DEA conducts like a formal review, your NDA should present the case for an appropriate rescheduling. So in that case, while the EO, executive order doesn't mandate concurrent DEA review, it's a strategic imperative, to start collecting, robust abuse potential data from your very first trial, because that data will shape both FDA approval as well as DEA scheduling down the road.
And on CMC now, faster review sounds great until manufacturing isn't ready. So how often do you see CMC catch companies off guard? This is maybe a little broader.
I do think that this is a great question, because it could be just CMC could be the most risky part of proceeding under the national priority vouchers. Mostly because the psychedelics face a unique challenge of DEA quota constraints. So there's basically a timing trap. Standard FDA review provides 10 to 12 months from NDA submission to approval, but the national priority voucher compresses that into 1 to 2 months. So the DEA timelines have not changed at all. A Schedule 1 registration takes about 16 to 20 weeks. A quota application can take 4 to 6 months. And then, you have to get approved for that quota. The total timeline might be at minimum an extra 9 months minimum. So if your, CMO, your contract manufacturing organization, waits until after the national priority voucher is approved to apply for a quota, you've lost, 6 to 9 months of your launch potentially. So just to back up a little bit, the quotas are substance specific, and they're finite. They're approved every year on an annual basis, and so by under the federal law. So if your CMO, your contract manufacturing organization, has a Schedule 1 registration, they also need to have that substance specific quota allocation. So it's basically, just because they have one for psilocybin doesn't mean they're going to have one for LSD. That's just my only point. So if you have multiple, national priority voucher programs approved simultaneously, then you're competing potentially for the same finite pool, depending on what those investigational drugs are. So under federal regulations, there's a 55% inventory freeze on manufacturing. The DEA regulation creates inventory thresholds at 40% baseline and 55% freeze triggers when production halts for all clients. So once that inventory drops to at 50%, they can restart manufacturing. And so that just, if your contract manufacturing organization serves multiple clients and has like one demand surge for that one compound, and they hit a freeze threshold, production will have to stop under the federal guidelines, including, your orders. And so you might be at the mercy of someone else's poor planning if you are, not of a priority production. And you can work on that with your CMO to get that kind of guarantee and visibility, some transparency about what priority you would be in terms of manufacturing, which is something, I would advise. So critical questions I would ask are, your CMO are, what are your current substance specific quota allocations? So what's your current psilocybin allocation? And how much of it is committed to other clients? And when are you going to submit your DEA form, 189? And, and the biggest of all probably is, if the quota becomes insufficient, whose orders get priority? And I would advocate that folks seek to get that contractually straightened out. So that one of those things that is very unique, is not unknown, but it's unique in Schedule 1 and Schedule 2 substances, is to have a quota issue. So, most sponsors that from traditional pharma assume manufacturing is just straightforward, but for psychedelics, you'll need 6 to 9 months of DEA quota planning, and you would need contractual protections that account for the finite national quota, addressing inventory freeze thresholds and multiple client competition.
It's going to be an interesting orchestration of these quotas, and see if there's any bottlenecks.
I think so.
Yeah. Back to RTT.
My understanding is that there's no quota. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, please.
Sorry,
please.
I didn't mean to cut you off. No, I was just going to say that I've heard that LSD is nowhere near their quota, but we might have a quota issue with psilocybin.
Oh, you think?
That I've just heard that through the grapevine. So yeah, I guess time will tell. We'll see, as things go on. But,
and back to the right to try. So it will generate and control outcomes data that sets public expectations. And how does a sponsor design a trial that can, outperform what in controlled data can show?
Well, that's touching upon kind of like a little bit what we discussed earlier.
Yeah.
That's where the regulatory science meets public perception management.
Yes, yeah.
So, once the right to try activates, once that pathway is activated, which it's not quite yet, but once it will be, the treating physicians will report outcomes generating probably pretty impressive sounding numbers, like maybe something like 70% of these patients will report significant depression improvement. And, public, the media, investors might latch on to those numbers. But the problem is that that's uncontrolled data, and that's systematically biased towards positive outcomes. Because
no more placebo, right?
Yeah, no more placebo. There's selection bias. There's a lack of standardized assessments. So yeah, you're completely right. I mean, the placebo controlled trials that are mandated, under FDA in order to show efficacy will probably show more MOS effects, because you're trying to control for the placebo effect. So you might see 50% response rate versus 30% placebo. And then the public might ask, like, well, why is that controlled trial showing worse results than right to try? So, some of the things, I think your question was quite sharp in terms of how would you, are there any clinical trial design solutions? And I would say that, trying to show durability is a differentiator. So the uncontrolled right to try data will capture acute effects like 1 week or 1 month. So your trial should emphasize, sustained effects. That primary endpoint at 3 to 6 months, measuring for sustained remission, relapse prevention design that compares, the time to relapse, and longitudinal follow-up for 12 months, like for instance. So, and you can also design it, to look at functional outcomes, not just symptom scales. So the right to try data will probably report symptom improvement, but your trial should capture things like, return to work, quality of life using validated instruments, suicide-related outcomes, utilizing things like the Columbia Suicide Severity Rating Scale, and functional remission with return to pre-illness functioning type of thing. So these outcomes are harder to achieve, but they also can't easily be captured in an uncontrolled right to try, setting. So, and the other thing to possibly consider is to collaborate in some way. Consider the right to try data as like real world evidence. So instead of fighting it, you can try to find ways to integrate it strategically. So that would mean setting up a registry with data, trying to capture data for comparative effectiveness and trying to adjust for baseline differences. And I think that might be a tough thing to do, but it's still out there as a potential possibility. So, I mean, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, it's a little bit of a Pandora box, the right to try.
Yeah, it is. It is. I mean, I do think that you're right, Alex, that it will generate optimistic, uncontrolled data. So your trial has to demonstrate kind of clear, durable, bias-controlled benefits that uncontrolled observations just can't credibly claim. So, and then communicate that in a way, communicate that distinction so that, media and your investors and, regulators understand this distinction.
Switching to ibogaine now, that has established cardiotoxicity and it's explicitly in the right to try provision. So what does a safety pharmacology package need to contain when the same compound is running in control and in controlled settings simultaneously?
That is, I do think that's a great question. I mean, ibogaine has been explicitly mentioned in, Section 2B of the executive order. And it doesn't have breakthrough therapy designation status, but it's a compound with known life-threatening cardiotoxicity. And if you put it in under right to try, we did hear of one. I believe it's Demorex. Demorex got their IND cleared just like, is it yesterday or
yesterday? Yes.
Yesterday.
Or noribogaine, yeah.
Noribogaine, which is a metabolite of ibogaine. So both compounds, just to make it clear, I don't know who our audience is, but to make it clear, noribogaine gets converted into, metabolized into ibogaine gets converted into noribogaine. You're the chemist, so you let me know if I got this wrong. But and noribogaine is known to have also the same cardiotoxicity as ibogaine. So it's part and parcel of the same package. So while this creates the potential of basically noribogaine being available under right to try, and so in a compound known with cardiotoxicity in an uncontrolled setting, while sponsors are also attempting to generate safety data in a controlled trial, it's basically a huge challenge. So just so everyone's on the same page, the cardiotoxicity in that compound is well established. There's what we call QT prolongation of torsades, and it can cause sudden cardiac death, drug interactions with medications that prolong the QT issue in the heart, even worse. But nevertheless, even though it's a high risk drug, it shows a great deal of promise for opioid addiction and other addictions. which is why the executive order mentioned it, I'm sure, and including it under the Right to Try Act. But for FDA approval, you'll need comprehensive safety pharmacology. There are some some really tight guidelines about preclinical cardiovascular studies, including like hERG channel assays, telemetry studies, metabolite safety that evaluates noribogaine, drug-drug interactions, methadone, and other medications. And there's all kinds of cardiac risk stratification tools that the FDA will require the sponsor to undergo. So the Right to Try Act really kind of complicates everything. I heard, I read this in a quote recently, that it's like basically ibogaine is like diving into the deep end of the psychedelic pool. And I just thought that captured the imagery. So it just, so you're going to put ibogaine into under a Right to Try framework, you're going to get problems, right? Heterogeneous safety data. Your controlled trial is going to generate rigorous data, but the Right to Try Act generates variable quality data. Mm-hmm. And there might be adverse event attribution where sudden cardiac death during under a Right to Try access gets reported to the FDA, and then you'll have to deal with it as a sponsor. You'll probably get, potentially be part of your IND. So it just, bottom line, it's ibogaine's cardiotoxicity and the Right to Try access creates kind of a perfect storm. Mm-hmm. The safety package, when you're the sponsor, the safety package must be rigorous. And then you're going to have to recognize, if you're going to make it available under Right to Try, mm-hmm. that sudden cardiac events in an uncontrolled setting might derail your development program. So mm-hmm. it is indeed just a pretty risky collision between, executive order suggestion and creation of a pathway to a drug that is known with cardiotoxic effects.
Mm-hmm. I don't have the numbers on top of my head, but I've read that magnesium can mitigate the cardiotoxic effects of ibogaine on patients. So maybe having an IV of magnesium might help. But
perhaps I don't know what I don't know what the clinical trial setup is specifically mm-hmm. for the ibogaine trials, but mm-hmm. or noribogaine in this case, but mm-hmm. It's essentially similar. A rescue, you're suggesting as like a rescue medication or something like that when you start seeing, or maybe prophylactically they're administered. Oh.
Yeah, it has been shown. I don't have this reference for these studies. I think it's probably the Stanford study. Mm. But anyway, so my last question on resilient pharmaceuticals, former Lykos. So Resilient was criticized for instructing sites not to record euphoria-like effects as adverse events. So what do you think? Is it a data integrity violation or a study design flaw, or without throwing them under the bus because they were the first to kind of Christian that path? Yeah.
Right. I do think this topic generated a lot of discussion within the mm-hmm. industry. It's both the data integrity issue that probably originated from a study design flaw. Mm-hmm. And mm-hmm. I just think it illustrates the broader challenge that psychedelic drug developers, sponsors face. Because the regulations require sponsors to report adverse events to FDA, and the investigators also have obligation to report adverse events to sponsors. So an adverse event is defined as anything that's like an untoward medical occurrence that's associated with the use of a drug in humans, whether or not it's considered drug related. So it's on the investigator, not on the sponsor, to determine what constitutes an adverse event. Mm-hmm. Sponsors are not supposed to instruct investigators on how to selectively exclude events from adverse event reporting. But, that decision actually belongs to the investigator. And euphoria is considered an adverse event, even if it's an expected drug effect, because it could impair judgment or lead to risky behavior or be distressing or be considered abuse potential. But I suspect that that instruction stemmed from confusion about how to handle these expected psychedelic effects. Psychedelics are known to produce profound effects like altered perception, euphoria, mystical experiences, and it's been argued that that's part of the therapeutic mechanism. But if every patient reports euphoria and then investigators code it as AE, as adverse events, then the safety database becomes cluttered with all these adverse events that are actually intended drug effects. But so the instruction that the investigators to not record euphoria was not the solution, though. I would say that I believe this is how they've been approaching it, is that they've been addressing this issue through clinical study design. So using a validated scale like the mystical experience questionnaire or like the altered states of consciousness analysis to capture euphoria and other psychedelic effects as data. So it gets captured as data and not as adverse effects in that, not as adverse events necessarily. But in your protocol, I would define expected drug effects to not be, one of the things, my understanding is that the regulators have been saying it should be defined as an AE. But something to explore is that maybe you could use these scales, the mystical experience questionnaire, etc., to capture, lower effects of euphoria. But anything that is more moderate or severe is captured as an AE. But I have been hearing from other folks in the industry that basically a lot of the euphoria needs to be captured as an AE. But it does seem to me that
disqualifying.
That you
when it's actually qualifying.
That it would that there might be some way to segregate mild from really adverse effects, things that are disorienting that causes impairment in judgment and that sort of thing. So I can see that, but perhaps they even want to capture even mild euphoria as potential drug abuse. I do think that there might be some room in the conversation for that, but ultimately it was ruled that Lykos's instruction was considered a data integrity violation, but it probably stemmed from the study design, because they're the first to first psychedelic to actually go through an NDA. So a potential better approach would be to require protocol defined criteria using validated assessment tools. But this is something, it's a tension that the psychedelic sponsors have to navigate, between capturing therapeutic subjective effects as well, and then maintaining rigorous safety data.
Well, thank you so much, Kim, for your time and precious insights. Do you have any closing arguments, like they say in the courtroom, I guess? I don't know.
I do think we're at just almost 1 week since the executive order came out. And just this morning, 3-party vouchers were awarded. And then yesterday we saw Demerex's IND approved. All kinds of things are changing quickly. I do think this is an area to watch. Back in January, I was at the JP Morgan week in San Francisco, where it was announced by STAT that they believe that psychedelics is the next big category. I do think we're on the way to that.
Great, thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much. Stay with me just 1 second.
Sure.
I'm just thank you everybody for tuning in. If you have any message for me or Kim, please email me at alex@cascades-analytics.com. It'll be my pleasure to forward your questions to Kim. And you can also DM me on LinkedIn, of course. And next week we'll have Dr. Deborah Mash of Demerex to talk about Norabogaine for alcohol use disorder as well as PTSD. Thank you so much for tuning in. See you next time.